What would make this an especially useful conversation for you today?
Basically, my issue is with most strongly supported questions. That's been like an issue, especially like inference related. So
Okay. And how do you approach them right now?
currently, I try to like read the stimulus to try to get a better understanding. Ask myself like, what is the stimulus saying, and then what by looking at each of the facts listed, what is actually like which one of the answer choices is what the stimulus is saying.
Right. Yeah. You're looking for what's incredibly likely to be the case based on the stimulus, not 100% guaranteed necessarily, but maybe 90 to 95% supported where you would place a bet on it happening. And it would be a reasonable assumption to make. Not necessarily 100%. That's not your standard, but incredibly close.
Okay.
So don't look for that 100% standard. You may not always meet it.
Okay. So how would you like go about like answering a MSS question? Like what would be your step-by-step for that?
Well, it really depends on how the stimulus is organized, because some of them, most of them are really just going to be fact sets. And in that case, there are a couple of different directions it could take. It could be a paraphrase of the entire stimulus or a summary of the entire stimulus. It could be a paraphrase of part of the stimulus, or it could be the combination of two different parts of the stimulus to generate a new reasonable inference. So you don't always know which direction it's going to go. And I think simply having these things in mind gives you a sense of what to look for.
Okay, that makes sense.
Then there's always, of course, process of elimination as well.
Mm-hmm. So how would you eliminate, like, how would you tell the difference from the wrong answer to the right answer?
Well, the wrong answer will be things that we really most likely have no clue about, where the stimulus does not speak directly on them, and it could go either way. That's typically what happens. In some cases, it may be something that's directly prohibited by the stimulus, in which case it certainly would not be supported. In fact, it could not be true. But most of the wrong answers will just be things that we really have no clue one way or the other.
Okay, thank you. And then another question in logical reasoning that is hard for me is sufficient assumption and necessary assumption, mostly necessary assumption. Can you explain that as well?
Sure. Do you feel like you have a handle on the difference between them?
Yeah, I know sufficient assumption is something that makes the conclusion valid, while necessary assumption is more something that solidifies it, like the whole conclusion. Well, sufficient covers the gaps that's in the between the premises and the conclusion. And necessary assumption is like what is relied upon, what is necessary to make the whole conclusion make sense, the whole argument make sense.
Good. So necessary is relied upon, and you said sufficient assumption covers, meaning it guarantees it 100%. But necessary, it's not something that will close the gap necessarily. Rather, it's something that simply is one thing the argument requires. There could be multiple necessary assumptions, and the necessary assumption does not have to guarantee the argument. That's the wrong perspective from which to view it. Instead, you want to look for, if you assume the stimulus to be given, what needs to be the case. So you could actually think of necessary assumption questions like a very specific kind of must be true question, because it's not really new information. It may not be stated outright, but it is implicit in the argument itself.
Okay. And also another issue, switching to reading comprehension, is the science passages. Like how does one get through all the language, the not having a scientific background and what they're talking about? How would you get through each of those passages and answer the questions effectively?
Well, it's practice and exposure. Science passages and topics, whether it's LR or reading comp, it's tough because it's unfamiliar and because it's not your background. So you may not have as much familiarity with it. You may not be as comfortable with the topics or the language, but just more exposure and more practice is really the solution. And you can do every LSAT has at least one science passage. So you have nearly 100 available to you to practice on and just read through and summarize and capture the main ideas. I would also suggest that you caricature or exaggerate the different viewpoints in the passage to make them more relatable. and focusing on the expressions of those viewpoints and the lines in which they appear rather than the details, because those you can skip and always come back to later. You just want to know where to find them. So I wouldn't want you to get bogged down in those details. Instead, I want you to simply capture those main ideas and summarize them, paraphrase them in your own words. While you're studying, you could talk it over with a friend or a coach or a tutor or a study group, or look at explanations to see if your articulation is spot on. And then you could also look at what details there were and later parse them out, but not in the moment. In the moment, you just want to focus on capturing those main ideas.
Okay. And how does one like find the main idea in a reading comprehension passage, especially through all the answer choices? Because for me, I know that when I go through the answer choices, sometimes I fall for like either a trip answer, or I fall for like a main idea that's too specific and not general enough to capture the whole essence of the passage.
Yeah, well, you want to make sure, of course, it encompasses the entire passage, that it applies to all parts, not simply one particular paragraph. A lot of the tempting wrong answers will be technically true, but they're not comprehensive enough. And as for where to find the main idea, it's the author's opinion wherever they express it. That is usually a sense of where the main idea is going to be. And so if there's any opinion expressed without it being attributed to a person or a group, that's probably the author. And if they're making any prescriptive statements or value judgments, saying something should be the case or something is incomplete or flawed in some way. If they say X is flawed, but there's no speaker for X, that's the author, so that's their main idea. And again, process of elimination is especially useful on reading comp.
Okay. So what tips would you have in regards to process of elimination? Like how would you know like, okay, this answer is wrong for sure?
Well, in general, a lot of times the tempting wrong answers are the right answer to the wrong question. So I gave that example of reading comp. In logical reasoning, it might be for a necessary assumption question, they will put a very tempting sufficient assumption answer, which feels good because it feels strong, but still not what they're looking for. So part of your review process should be to evaluate why exactly are each of these choices wrong? And for the toughest ones, why might someone be prone to picking them? Why might it feel good, but actually be wrong? And in reading comp, a lot of times, most of the choice will be good, but then there's one little word, usually towards the end of the choice, that makes it technically wrong. So the entire choice has to be correct. So look for those little words that go a little bit too far.
Okay. And another reading comp question, in terms of the comparative passages, like what is the best strategy to get through those passages and to answer the questions effectively, as well as to capture like both of the passages and what their like main ideas are?
Yeah, these are definitely, they're tougher. There's no two ways about it. And they're not as prone to tricks. One thing you could look for is, before you read both passages, are there any questions referring to only one of the two? In some passages, there will be a question only on passage B. And so you could read passage B only, solve the question related to passage B, then you go back and read A and solve all the remaining ones. That's one general trick I would suggest. But overall, it's really just having a handle on what's the main idea of each, and then looking as you're reading for areas where they have an expressed disagreement or an expressed agreement, and then where does one of them go that the other doesn't? So you have a handle on the differences.
Okay, thank you. And now switching to logic games, the issue for me is grouping games and how to know which diagram to use for what kind of grouping game, or how to know like how to go about a grouping game.
Yeah, so with grouping games, there's a variety of types of grouping games. There's in, out, and selection, there's matching, there's splitting, and there's curveballs. And so you want to have a handle on what exactly are they asking you to do. That will dictate the kind of diagram that you create. If it's a game with lots of conditional rules and it's about choosing some but not others, that's selection, aka in, out, and you may want to make a T-chart. You may want to make a long conditional chain connecting the rules. For a matching game, the task is when you're assigning variables of one group to variables of another group. You're associating them, but there's no order involved. And so the task that you're given determines the kind of diagram that you create. And so I wouldn't just say, do a bunch of grouping games in a row. I would say, do specifically in-out games in a row, then do matching games in a row. So you can see what kinds of setups and what kinds of rules are associated with different game types, and then as a result, different diagrams.
Okay, so for me specifically matching games, like how would you make that inference, because there are some games where you're just like, it stumps you up with the diagramming, and then after you kind of figure out what to diagram, now it's trying to figure out, okay, like how can I make an inference with this? Like where do I know which piece to go where and that kind of thing.
Well, you'd want to think about choosing one set of variables as your base, where you're drawing 5 slots horizontally, and those are the 5 different buckets you're going to place another category of variables into. So I would start there, honestly. You might have, for example, there's one game where you're giving mannequins pieces of clothing. So each mannequin gets a hat, jacket, and skirt, and then you're assigning colors to those. And so if there's 3 colors and 3 articles of clothing, you're going to lay out the articles of clothing, hat, jacket, skirt. You may even do it vertically, like they're on a person. And then you would also then associate the colors into those slots. So you'd be writing down red, navy, and yellow into the slots for hat, jacket, and skirt.
Okay. And also for mixed games, like when there's a lot of variables involved, like even 3 different kinds of variables involved, like how do you go about it? Because those tend to like cause a little bit of stress or anxiety for a test taker, especially for me. So
yeah, well, mixed games are going to be tougher. They're combining elements of multiple game types. And so I would want you to get proficient in the ordering and grouping games first, so that you can get better at dealing with them when they're combined. And then when they are combined, I would say deal with one element before dealing with the other element. So a game that involves group in and out grouping with ordering, I would deal with the selection element first, so that you then know who it is you're actually placing in order versus who's not getting placed at all.
Okay. And now, like in terms of timing, like how does one get faster with logic games?
Well, you get faster at anything by getting better at it, and you get better at it by practicing and doing more of it. But in terms of getting faster on games, once you're already reasonably proficient, I would say reuse your previous work. All hypothetical scenarios that you draw, save them on your scratch paper so that you can refer to them when you need them for the more general global questions.
Okay.
The other thing I would suggest is considering doing the questions in the order that works for you, rather than doing them simply in the order given. So you might want to do the local if questions before doing those general global questions, so that you have more hypotheticals available to you, more scenarios available when you want to solve those more general ones. And those previous scenarios that you already drew could help you eliminate some choices from the general questions, and occasionally even give you the answer without you having to do any additional work.
Okay. And now for like reading comp, how does one get faster at reading comprehension? And then how does one get faster at logical reasoning as well?
Sure. For reading comp, I would suggest you do less note taking. Too often students write down too much, or they'll annotate too much. And on the digital LSAT especially, highlighting and underlining doesn't work that well. So I wouldn't use it. I would just do any note taking on the scratch paper to the side, but I would keep it very minimal, limited to summarizing main ideas and different viewpoints. I would also then do questions in a particular order. I would do the global general questions first, like main idea, primary purpose, passage organization, etc. Then I would do the local questions. Then I would do the toughest inferential questions. So I'm doing them in a general order of difficulty. For logical reasoning, there is a general order of difficulty there already, from easy to hard within the section. And so I would work faster on the easier questions and trust your gut on those, and build up a time bank for the tougher questions later in the section.
Okay, got you. What other question do I have? So back to logical reasoning, in terms of like assumption questions and flaw questions, which pretty much make up a lot of the exam, how would you go about answering them, especially ones that are like, for flaw questions, there's one that talks about this flaw is assumed if, or trying to figure out which flaw matches with which in that sense, because sometimes they're worded in a very like weird way, so it's hard to figure out what flaw you're looking at, because it's not going to directly say like ad hominem, or not directly going to say hold apart. So
yeah, well, you've got to have a really good handle on what the flaw is for yourself before looking at the choices. Ideally, at least, it'll make it much easier to recognize the flaw in their articulation of it if you already have your own sense of what it means. So I would want you to slow down and take the time to thoroughly understand the argument for yourself and identify the flaw on your own in your own words. Then later, look for their articulation of it in the choices. And a lot of times they do use abstract language, which is really tough to parse out. And so
Yeah.
as an exercise, you might want to define for yourself, what exactly are each of these 5 choices saying? Which flaws are they referring to? Because even if it's the wrong answer now, it might be the right answer to a different question. And sometimes if you don't understand what it means, you might just pick it for that reason alone. But it is possible to understand these. I mean, they repeat themselves again and again with this language. And so just as a drill or as an exercise, you could go through an entire section of logical reasoning and pull out all choices with abstract language, whether it's flaw questions or role of statement questions or method of reasoning questions, and then figure out what are they saying and relating it back to different pieces of the argument.
Okay. And then parallel reasoning is one of those question types that can either eat up all your time or, depending on where it is in the section, could be like the easiest thing. So is it advisable for one to skip those questions, come back to it later, or for someone to just pull through those questions, like answer them? Or how would you handle parallel reasoning as well as principal questions?
Yeah, well, parallel reasoning questions, they're definitely going to be more time consuming. So if they're coming later in the section, I might save those for last. But if it's number 9, the method of reasoning probably isn't too bad. And so I would attempt it in the moment. As for techniques, a couple of things you can look for. You can look to match the degree of certainty in the conclusion. You can also look to match the category of things they're discussing. So rather than saying all people, they might say some people who take the LSAT. So they're saying some, then they're limiting the scope of that specifically to those who are taking the LSAT. They're qualifying their statements. You want an answer choice that matches that degree or that qualifier that they're using. Then degrees of certainty, always, never, most of the time, occasionally, you want to match that as well. So it really comes down to how good you are with a thesaurus in terms of looking for synonyms, looking to see whether things truly match or not. Then you could also just simply look for the method of reasoning. If you can, it's a bit more abstract, of course, but that's another way to do it. For principal questions, I don't really see principles as a separate question type. If you're referring to principal application, then yes, those are similar to parallel, time-consuming, lengthy, same approach there.
And in terms of improving your score, like right now, I'm pretty much at a median level of my score, and I'm trying to reach like a higher level. So going from like a 150 to a 160 or 150 to a 170. What advice would you have for someone who's trying to really like improve?
Yeah, so for the 160s, you've got to get really proficient in applying the strategies. And so I want you to have a solid strategy for every single question type and feel comfortable with it. Feel like you have a strong foundation. And so I would look to brush up on any weak areas like the types that we're discussing, go back and review those with my comments in mind. And then for the high 160s to 170s and beyond, it's really having a deeper understanding of why the strategies work and how they're constructed. So getting a sense of the underlying formulas that dictate this exam and better seeing the exam from the test maker's perspective in how they design the questions and then what tricks they use. So I would basically just get obsessed with this exam and read and watch everything you can about it and come to appreciate it for what it is, because it is a difficult exam and you can hate it for that reason, but you can also admire the people who create it for just how devious they are.
Okay, thank you. And then lastly, the writing section of the exam, which is pretty much like a part of the exam that no one really focuses too much on. But what techniques would you have for that as well? And how would you go about doing the writing portion, especially now that you have like the free time to do it?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't worry about it for now because you still have your LSAT ahead of you. Take the LSAT, get your score. And while you're waiting for your score, actually, you could work on it then, but I want you to focus entirely on the LSAT for now because you have a limited time window. But after the LSAT, you can take the writing sample anytime you want. It's still 35 minutes, but it's online from the comfort of your own home or computer, wherever you are. And so, yeah, you can practice a little bit. I think because it's typed, it's weighted a little bit more heavily because adcoms can actually read it now rather than parsing difficult to read handwriting. But basically, if you give it your best shot, you probably can't go wrong. You just have to make a choice between two options that are equally weighted, but still acknowledge the weaknesses of your side and the benefits of the other side.
Okay, so it's a typical like argument kind of question.
Yeah, just basically make your best argument, but still be reasonable in making it. Don't say that option A is the best option ever, and anyone who chooses option B is an idiot. You know, you have to consider that they're equally weighted. So option B will have its pros and cons as well as option A will. So if you pick option A, also acknowledge the strengths of B, but say the downsides of B outweigh the pros, and that's based on a value judgment, which is okay to make in this case. You do have to pick one side.
Okay. I think that's pretty much it in terms of like LSAT issues and things of that sort. I think for a big issue for me is like inferring, like making inferences across the board. Minus logic games, I feel like reading comp and logical reasoning, it's hard for me to like see or find what's not being stated in a passage or what's not being stated in a logical reasoning question. So what advice would you have in regards to finding inferences amongst those things, or like to reading between the lines with such a minimal amount of time that you have on the exam?
Yeah, part of your review process should be for all of those, especially those tougher reading comp inferential questions, reading between the lines. There are still lines supporting every single correct answer. And so as an exercise, go and find them. They might refer to things in a backwards sort of way or a very hidden way, but there is always support in the text, even if they refer to it in a way that's hard to find.
Makes sense.
Anyway, it's been great connecting with you. What would you say is the biggest insight you got from our call today?
The biggest thing that I got from this conversation is pretty much this test is doable. It's not like something that's really, really hard. But also I learned about myself while asking these questions that I overthink a lot, which makes it hard for me to make the inferences, which makes it hard for me to understand the question or the stimulus because I'm thinking too much about it. Also understanding how to answer MSS questions, which has been a huge like issue for me, which is that the answer is in the stimulus. It's not like something far out, and it's something that's likely not like 100% clear. So there's that, as well as with mixed games, understanding, having a good basis for sequencing games as well as grouping games will help with mixed games. And also solidifying my diagramming would make mixed games run a little better compared to how I'm running them now. And in terms of science passages for reading comp, understanding, not having to understand the whole passage, getting past all the hard vocabulary and getting past all of that, just finding the main ideas of each paragraph will make it easier to answer the questions as well. So that's a lot. I got a lot out of this conversation, honestly.
Great. I'm really glad to hear it. Please keep in touch and let me know if you need anything at all as you move forward.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.